This is Grape Video 27, Pruning Grapevines when they are approaching full size. I rather questioned what I should entitle this video because often when vines are approaching full size, it is the time just before the start of the third growing season of the vineyard, but that assumes everything's going well. And that's not always the case, so I had to put in parentheses often before the start of the third growing season. For example, here is a vineyard that is at the end of its second growing season, and it has filled the trellis well with growth in its first 2 years. And so we're definitely in a position to take this about to be third year vineyard and treat it in a way that will bring the vineyard on to full production. But not this vineyard. Can you tell that this vineyard is actually many years old? The hints are about 3 or 4 large diameter trunks that are many years old, and then lots of vines that look like they're only 2 to 3 years old. This vineyard, trained to Geneva double curtain, has issues. I don't recall what they are, but with trunks as old as they are on a few vines and the other vines being brought up, there are issues in this many-year-old vineyard that prevent us from managing this vineyard as though it were about to be filled with full-sized vines. This picture tells the story that the use of Geneva double curtain training was not appropriate because that's for extremely large vines, and this vineyard just doesn't have it after many years. Well, here's another situation. This vineyard that I was in, if you want to call it a vineyard, many years ago, had vines planted for quite some time, a few years. And it was a good vineyard site. It was on nice sloping ground. The soils were nicely well drained. And yet these vines were struggling for the obvious reason of very poor weed control, and the vines were never going to reach full size under these conditions because the weeds were out competing the vines. Here's another picture of that same situation. My goodness, why bother planting vines if you're going to treat them like this? And yet another situation. Here is a vineyard that was at least 10 to 12 years old and existing in a very poor vineyard site that often had standing water between the rows, very heavy soils. And the grower started to abandon the vineyard and then started to work it again, and you can see a small tree growing off to the right there. If we look closer, here is a vine struggling to come up from the ground with some dead trunks, and if you look close enough you can see the remnants of crown galling. And I just noticed right now, right near the base of those old trunks, poison ivy. Yikes. So you can have a vineyard many years old and the vines are still not approaching full size for various reasons. Let's look at another example. Here is a vineyard, if you believe, 9 years old. And I'm looking down that wire that the vines have been tied to is about 3 feet off the ground. So this Merlot vine, after 9 years, has barely made vines right in this location 3 feet tall. You're not about to treat this as vines that are approaching full size. The problem here, the basic problem, was heavy soils, waterlogged, that prevented root development. And then that was made worse by several repeated spring freezes and winter injury. So the vine just keeps struggling year after year. And the vineyard has had reasonably decent management, even though there has been very little progress. This is an indication that before you just go in and prune the vine for yet one more year, to take a hard look at the appropriateness of having a vineyard here, or the appropriateness of the management in terms of what could be done. Could you change the drainage patterns in the soil here enough to bring these vines on? So I put all these pictures here in front of you to suggest that just because a vineyard is about to go into, say, its third year or fourth year does not mean that all of a sudden we have a fully productive vineyards of vines that are approaching full size. And when you don't have those full-sized vines, you have to go back and do what we showed in the previous video on a year 2 vineyard. All you can do is prune out 1 or 2 canes and tie them up like this, or like this, and work on correcting the basic problems of the vineyard. There are often empty vine spaces in a new vineyard. We don't get 100% of vines to start and grow well. So often you look at a fairly new vineyard and there will be empty vine spaces. And if you're working with own-rooted vines, then the third growing season of a vineyard may be an excellent opportunity to utilize layers for filling in vine spaces. Here's the schematic of the layering technique as we presented it in Grape video 24. And this could be an excellent time to utilize this technique for filling in those empty spaces in a young vineyard that's going into its third growing season, when other vines adjacent to these vacant spaces are becoming full size. Okay, let's go back to this picture because it's more friendly and it's more encouraging to look at a vineyard that's been well managed through its first 2 years. So it's got large vines like this. And as we go into the year where the vines are full-sized, what are we going to do? Well, when we're dealing with a vineyard that is approaching full vine size, the first thing we must do is to decide on the vine training system if we haven't decided already. And those are covered in great detail in Grape videos 6 through 19. This is the top wire Cordon training system as presented in Grape video 12. And say that we choose this, for example, for the training system of our new vineyard when the vines are approaching full size. And here we have it. Here is a third-year vineyard looking up at vines that are trained with 2 young trunks and then a cane going each way, and we start that top wire Cordon. It looks wonderful. But not all vines perform equally. So if we look closely, here is a vine that does not allow full training of that Cordon. We do as much as we can in this third year or the year of full vine size, and we work to continue the establishment of the Cordon on that vine in a subsequent year. Here's another situation. Don't those vines look nice at the start of the growing season? But there's one vine on the left here that didn't get enough growth to be able to be fully trained. There it is. So we use the technique of training that vine up with a couple of canes tied to the top wire, sort of repeating the course of what we would have done in year 2. And by the next year, that vine is likely to be large enough to be fully trained with a top wire cordon. So we're just trying to convey that in this transition to full vine size, some vines will be ready, others not, and you just have to deal with it vine by vine. Here is one of the most critical parts of vines as they are approaching full size. For the first time, a grower will have the opportunity to keep a lot of fruiting buds on the vine. There'll be lots of opportunity to retain lots of fruiting buds, and the vine really is not so large to be able to handle all that productivity. And so approaching full vine size, or typically the third growing season, is a critical time for the grower to manage the vines to avoid overcropping. That's why we put this picture in, to say, be careful, because it's so easy to leave so many fruiting buds on the vine at that time of the vineyard development that you will overcrop the vines, produce a large crop of poor quality fruit, and keep the development of the vine size repressed so that it doesn't get really to be full sized. Be careful of overcropping. Well, that's it. This has been a short video trying to give some pointers on vine management when they approach full size. In our next video, we're going to do the actual pruning of mature vines and show examples of how we take all the information that we've been sharing with you in the past 10 videos or so, pull it all together, and actually prune grapevines that are mature and of full size. Until then, happy grape growing.